The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and apples that morning. I had been up since 5, the way I always am now that there's no one else in the house to sleep in for. I was standing at the counter, pressing pie crust into the dish my mother gave me 40 years ago, the one with a small chip on the rim that I never had the heart to throw away. The radio was on low. Outside, the oak tree in the backyard had turned completely gold. It was the kind of quiet Tuesday morning that used to feel peaceful to me. It doesn't anymore. I set the pie in the oven, wiped my hands on my apron, and picked up my phone. I don't know why I do that. It's a habit now, like checking the locks before bed. I opened my messages and I saw it. A text from my son. I want you to understand something before I tell you what it said. My son is 34 years old. He has a good job, a house in a nice suburb outside of Columbus, and a wife named Diane who has never once called me by my first name, not in 6 years of marriage. He has a daughter, my granddaughter, who turned 4 in September. I found out about that birthday from a photo on Facebook. I was not invited to the party. I sent a card and a small stuffed rabbit. I don't know if my granddaughter ever received it. My son never mentioned it. I read the text standing there in my kitchen with flowers still on my hands. It said, "Mom, we've decided Thanksgiving is just going to be us this year. It's better for Diane and honestly better for everyone. Please don't make this into something. You always make things harder than they need to be." I read it twice. Then I put the phone face down on the counter and I stood there for a long time listening to the oven hum. You always make things harder than they need to be. I have been a mother for 34 years. I buried my husband 3 years ago in October, a man named George who coached Little League and made his own hot sauce and never once in 31 years of marriage forgot my birthday. When George died, my son flew in for the funeral and stayed for 4 days, and then he went back to Columbus, and the calls got shorter and then less frequent and then nearly stopped. I understood that. Grief does strange things. People pull inward. I gave him time. What I did not do was say a word about the money. It started 8 months after the funeral. My son called, which surprised me because it was a Wednesday afternoon and he never called on weekdays. He sounded tired. He said Diane had taken some time off work and things were tight and he was wondering if I could help them out with the mortgage that month, just that once. He said he was embarrassed to ask. He said Dad would have understood. I transferred $2,200 that same evening. That once became twice. Twice became every month. By the following spring, I was sending $1,500 on the first of every month, automatically, the way you pay a utility bill. My son set up the recurring transfer himself. He texted me a thumbs up emoji when it went through the first time. I want to be honest with you because I think honesty is the only thing that matters when you get to my age. The truth is, I kept sending it partly because I loved him and partly because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I stopped, the calls would stop too, and then there would be truly nothing left. George was gone. My daughter lives in Portland, and we are close in the way that long-distance relationships allow, which means we talk on Sunday evenings and visit twice a year and love each other from a careful distance. My son was 40 minutes away. The money felt like a thread. I held on to it. I also want to be honest about something else. I am not a woman without resources. George had life insurance. We had savings. I own this house outright. I am not wealthy, but I am comfortable, and my son knew that. He had known that since the estate was settled. I sometimes wonder now if that is when things shifted, though I cannot say for certain. What I can say is that in the 2 years I was sending that money, my son brought my granddaughter to see me exactly once. She sat on my couch for 45 minutes while Diane scrolled her phone. And then they left because Diane said the drive back would be worse if they waited. My granddaughter had applesauce on her chin when she walked in, and I wiped it off, and she looked at me with George's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green, and I thought my heart would simply stop from the weight of it. That was 14 months before the Thanksgiving text. I stood at my counter for a long time that morning. The pie was baking. The house smelled warm and good. I thought about calling my son, about trying to understand what I had done wrong, about asking him gently what he meant by, "You always make things harder." I thought about driving to Columbus and sitting down with him and Diane and trying to talk it through the way adults should. Then I thought about the thumbs up emoji. I thought about the birthday card I never got confirmation of. I thought about Diane scrolling her phone on my couch while my granddaughter sat stiff in her good jacket. I thought about 14 months of $1,500 on the first of every month and one visit in 2 years, and my son texting me on a Tuesday morning to tell me not to come for Thanksgiving and not to make it into something. I picked up my phone. I went to my banking app. I found the recurring transfer. My finger hovered over it for probably 30 seconds. Then I canceled it. I put the phone back down. I went to the oven and I checked my pie. The crust was turning a perfect gold around the edges, just the way George always liked it. I stood there in the warmth of the open oven, and for the first time in a very long time, something in my chest felt still. I called my daughter that evening, not to tell her what happened. I didn't want to do that yet, but just to hear her voice. We talked for an hour and a half. She told me about a hiking trail she'd found outside Portland, and a book she'd been reading, and a funny thing her cat had done. I laughed twice, real laughs, the kind that come up from somewhere deep. When I hung up, I sat in George's chair by the window and watched the oak tree in the last of the light. I slept better that night than I had in months. My son called the next morning at 7:52. I was in the backyard with my coffee, which is something I have started doing because George always said I spent too much time indoors, and he was right. I saw my son's name on the screen. I watched it ring. I watched it go to voicemail. He called again 12 minutes later. Voicemail. He called again 12 minutes later. Voicemail. The third call came at 9:15. By then I was inside sitting at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the crossword from the newspaper. I looked at his name on the screen for a long moment. Then I set the phone down and went back to the crossword. He left a message on that third call. I listened to it later. His voice was tight in the way it gets when he is trying to sound calm and isn't. He said there must have been a problem with the bank. He said the transfer hadn't gone through. He said could I look into it and call him back as soon as possible. He said it was important. There was no how are you. There was no I'm sorry about the text yesterday. There was no mom. Just the transfer. Just could I look into it. I did not call him back that day. I went to the grocery store instead. I bought good things. A small beef roast, fresh rosemary, a bottle of red wine that cost more than I usually spend. I came home and I put the roast in the slow cooker, and I opened the wine at 4 o'clock in the afternoon because I am 63 years old and George is gone, and I will open wine at 4 in the afternoon if I want to. I sat in the kitchen while the house filled with the smell of rosemary and beef, and I thought about my life. I thought about the woman I was before George died and the woman I had become since, and the difference between the two. The woman before had opinions and plans and a laugh that arrived without permission. The woman after had a banking app and a recurring transfer and a habit of checking her phone the way you check a wound. I thought about what my son had said in that voicemail, the problem with the bank. Not Mom, I think I understand what happened and I owe you an apology. Not Mom, I said something unkind yesterday and I've been thinking about it. Not Mom, I miss you and I'm sorry that Diane and I have been so absent and I want to do better. The problem with the bank. My son called again the following morning, and this time I answered. He went straight to the transfer. Was there a problem with my account? Had something changed? He could help me sort it out if I needed. He knew banking stuff could be confusing sometimes. I let him finish. I want you to know I was not cruel. I did not raise my voice. I did not bring up the text from Tuesday or the birthday card or the 14 months or Diane on my couch with her phone. I simply said, there's no problem with my account. I canceled the transfer. There was a silence. Benny said, what do you mean you canceled it? I said, I mean I went into the app and I stopped the payment. It's canceled. Another silence, longer this time. He said, Mom, we count on that. And I want you to hold that sentence for a moment, because I have turned it over in my hands every day since and it still takes my breath away a little. We count on that. Not I love you and I'm sorry. Not can we talk about what's been going on between us? We count on that. Like a paycheck, like a line item in a budget. I said, I know you do, but I've been thinking, and I don't believe it's been good for either of us. You're 34. You have a good job. You and Diane are capable adults, and it's time you managed your finances independently. I love you. I want good things for you, but I won't be sending money anymore." He said a few more things after that. His voice got less controlled. He said I was being dramatic. He said this was completely out of nowhere. He said Diane was going to be very upset. He said, and this one I did not expect, he said that I needed to think about what would happen when I was older and needed help, and whether burning bridges now was really the smart move. I breathed through that one. It cost me something to breathe through it without saying what I wanted to say. But I breathed through it. I said, "I hope that when I'm older, we'll have a better relationship than we do right now. I truly hope that. I love you. I have to go." I hung up. I stood in my kitchen, and I was shaking slightly the way you do after something has been building for a long time and then releases all at once. I gripped the counter and I breathed, and I looked out the window at the oak tree, which had lost most of its leaves by then, and stood bare against a white sky. And I thought, okay, there it is. 3 days passed, then 5. My son did not call. I spent those days doing things that surprised me. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I had been talking about doing since before George died. I had lunch with my neighbor Carol, who is 71 and funny and has been inviting me to things for 2 years while I declined. I drove to the nature preserve on the edge of town, where George and I used to walk on Sunday mornings, and I walked it alone, the whole 3 miles, and I cried a little in the middle, and then I kept going. On the 8th day, my son called again. His voice was different this time, quieter. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. He didn't apologize right away. It wasn't a clean or simple conversation. I won't pretend it was. There was defensiveness and there were long pauses, and at one point he said something about the stress he'd been under that I think was meant to be an explanation and came out closer to an excuse. But somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted. He got quiet in a different way, and he said, "I've been treating you like you're just there. Like you'll always be there and you don't need anything from us. And that's not fair. I know it's not fair." It wasn't enough. It wasn't everything. But it was something real, and in my experience, real is rarer than people think, so I received it carefully. I said, "I need to actually see you. I need to see my granddaughter. Not a visit where Diane is counting the minutes. A real one." He said he would talk to Diane is counting the minutes. A real one. He said he would talk to Diane. I want to be clear-eyed with you. I don't know how this ends. I am not someone who believes that one honest phone call repairs 2 years of distance. I know my son has things to work out with Diane, and that some of those things have nothing to do with me, and that grown children and their parents don't always find their way back to each other, no matter how much love is there underneath. I know that. What I know just as certainly is that I will not purchase proximity. I will not buy my way into my own family. I am 63 years old and I raised that boy with everything I had, and I cooked for him and drove him to practice and sat up with him when he was sick and stood in a cemetery 3 years ago in October holding his hand while we buried his father. And I deserve to be treated like a person who matters. Not a bank, not a utility, a person. My daughter came to visit for Thanksgiving after all. She flew in from Portland and slept in the guest room, and we cooked together all day Wednesday, flour on our hands, the radio on loud, laughing at nothing. On Thursday morning, I set the table with the good dishes, the ones from George's mother that I only use on occasions that count. We had turkey and 3 kinds of pie, and we sat at the table for 2 hours, talking after the food was gone. My son did not come. I won't lie to you and say that didn't hurt. It did. It hurt in the specific wordless way that only your children can hurt you, down in a place where the logic doesn't reach. But I sat at that table with my daughter and the good dishes and the pie I made from scratch and the oak tree just visible through the dining room window, bare and patient against the November sky, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like myself. I don't know what happens next with my son. I stopped trying to script it. What I know is that I made a decision in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning with flour on my hands, and it was the right one, and I would make it again. Sometimes love has to stop funding its own disrespect before it has any chance of becoming something real. I learned that late. But I learned it. If you're in a situation that feels like mine, If you've been holding on to someone with money because you're afraid to hold on to them any other way, I just want you to know that the fear on the other side of letting go is smaller than you think. There is a life waiting there. There are watercolor classes and long walks and good wine at 4 in the afternoon and your daughter laughing in your kitchen and the smell of rosemary and the particular gold of an oak tree in October. There is yourself waiting there. A little patient, still. There is something that happens to a person when they finally stop accepting less than they deserve. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It feels at first almost like nothing, just a quiet steadiness settling in where the anxiety used to live. That's what I felt when I canceled that transfer. Not triumph, not anger, just stillness. I think about the years I spent sending that money and telling myself it was love. And it was love in part. I won't take that away from myself. But it was also fear dressed up as generosity. I was paying to matter. I was paying to stay connected to a son who had quietly decided that connection was optional as long as the deposits were not. When I finally saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. The cause and the effect, when you trace them honestly, are never mysterious. I had taught my son over years of silent giving and swallowed hurt that my presence in his life had a price, and that price would always be paid. Every time I transferred the money without asking for anything in return, not a visit, not a phone call, not even an acknowledgement, I confirmed for him that this arrangement was acceptable, that I was acceptable on those terms. We don't think of it that way in the moment. We think we are being kind, being patient, keeping the peace. But what we are really doing sometimes is writing a contract we never intended to sign. What changed the equation wasn't rage. It was clarity. A text on a Tuesday morning that was just honest enough to show me exactly what I had become in my son's eyes. Not a mother, not a person with her own grief and loneliness and needs, but a resource. Manageable, reliable. Don't make it into something. That kind of clarity is a gift, even when it arrives wrapped in cruelty. Wisdom, I've come to believe, is not what you accumulate in good times. It's what you're willing to face in difficult ones. It took courage, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kitchen counter kind, to look at 2 years of distance and one dismissive text and decide that I was worth more than what I had been accepting. That is not a small thing. Many people spend their entire lives unable to make that decision, not because they lack love, but because they lack the willingness to risk discomfort for the sake of their own dignity. Strength is not the absence of pain. I cried on that walk through the nature preserve. I felt the hurt of an empty chair at Thanksgiving, like a physical weight. Strength is continuing anyway. Signing up for the watercolor class anyway. Having lunch with Carol anyway. Opening the wine at 4 o'clock and sitting in George's chair and choosing, deliberately, to still be present in your own life, even when the people you love most have made you feel invisible. My son said something real eventually. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't everything, but it was real. I think that happened precisely because I stopped making it easy for things to stay the same. Growth, in people, in relationships, in families, almost never happens in comfort. It happens at the edge of consequence when someone finally loves themselves enough to say, this far and no further. I am still learning what that looks like for me. I suspect I will be learning it for the rest of my life. But I know this. The woman who stood at that counter with flour on her hands and canceled that transfer made a choice for her own life. And every good thing that came after, my daughter's laugh, the smell of rosemary, the watercolor brushes still drying on the bathroom counter, came from that one quiet, clear, irreversible choice. You cannot control what other people do with the space you create when you stop shrinking, but you can control what you do with it. I chose to fill it with myself. Finally,